there you go. You have the natural order of things based on density and buoyancy and governed by the static electric charge of the Earth. So until recently, they didn't even claim to have physical evidence for gravity. That's when they came up with invented evidence from, I think, 1.2 billion years ago, 1.2 billion light years away. And they claim to have captured this evidence by LIGO. Yes, LIGO. It's an interferometer device, the largest in the world, I believe. There's 2 of them. And basically they picked up what are essentially vibrations on a chart. So as time went forward, activity on the chart went up. And that is their proof from gravity from 1.2 billion years ago. Yep, LIGO.
We have detected gravitational waves. They were detected by LIGO, the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory. LIGO is the most precise measuring device ever built. Let me start with what we saw. So on September 14th, 2015, Anna recorded a signal, and the signal had a very specific characteristic. The characteristic of, as time went forward, the frequency went up. And now it took us months of careful checking, rechecking, analysis, looking at every piece of data to make sure that what we saw was not something that wasn't a gravitational wave, but in fact it was a gravitational wave. And we've convinced ourselves. That's
the case, and we're here to announce that today.
By the way, this is not a Hollywood production that I'm going to show you. It is actually a real computer simulation, 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 a real computer simulation.
Talk about the gravitational waves. You didn't see any gravitational waves there. What you saw was actually the black holes. Now let me look at this from the gravitational wave perspective. So you're going to see again a computer simulation. This is a real simulation. So you're going to see again a computer simulation. This is a real simulation. A computer simulation. This is a real simulation. A computer simulation. This is a real simulation. A computer simulation. This is a real simulation.
Let me start with what we saw. So on September 14th, 2015, the 2 LIGO observatories in Hanford, Washington, and Livingston, Louisiana recorded a signal nearly at the same time, nearly simultaneously, and the signal had a very specific characteristic. The characteristic of, as time went forward, the frequency went up.
The concept of infinite space also goes right out the window when you realize flat Earth, and so too does the concept for gravity and space-time and all the rest, dark matter. In fact, the same can be said about nuclear hypotheses, which in my opinion entails what are essentially little solar systems at the atomic level. And while there is definitely use for the science that has been developed around observation in things like the periodic table of the elements and atomic weight and things like that, that is very helpful and very useful when visualizing things. But on the other hand, I just don't believe there are little particles called atoms and photons and electrons. I think that's a bunch of pseudoscience. At any rate, gravity is not scalable, which means while we should see evidence for gravity on the micro scale, or on the scale that we can sort of tangibly work with here in reality, much like magnetism is scalable. So it doesn't matter how large you make a magnetic system, it's going to work essentially the same way whether you make it in the nano scale or in a scale larger than life, right? Magnetism works scalably. Unfortunately, gravity is not scalable, and so when you take, let's say, a high-dense object, take a bowling ball, and you take some powdery substance of low density like flour, You know, you would expect to see evidence of gravity with the bowling ball acting upon the flour, you know, baker's flour or whatever, and yet you don't see that happen because gravity, well, frankly, it doesn't exist. There is no mass attracting mass. That's what they claim essentially that gravity is space-time is warped, and thus high density, high mass objects attract relatively smaller objects. And you don't see that on the micro level because it simply doesn't exist. The only experiments historically where they say that it exists is the Cavendish experiment, which is just an absolute fiasco.
Henry Cavendish, even though he was part of the rich dukes of Devonshire, that family, and incredibly rich, he went to Cambridge to study natural sciences, or natural philosophy as it's called. But he had a very curious condition in that he could hardly talk to anybody. So when it came to his Viva exam after 3 years of study, he fled Cambridge rather than sit in front of the examiners because he was petrified of them. But he was one of the most brilliant scientists of that 18th century in both chemistry and physics. For chemistry, he's noted because he analysed gases in the air. He discovered there was hydrogen, which is a huge component of the universe. He called it inflammable air. So he put some acids in a container, dropped some metal like zinc into hydrochloric acid, and got the gas to come off. And then to show it was inflammable, you could set light to it, he breathed it in and blew it into a candle. Now, do not do this at home because it blew up and took all the hairs off his face. He invented the idea of electric potential before everybody else and used to set electric currents through his body to work out the voltage was proportional to current, and he measured the current by the degree of agony he felt with the electrical current. This is not the normal sort of person.
Oh, Frederick, are you all right?
Yes. Would you excuse me for 1 minute, dear?
Oh, of course, Doctor.
Igor? May I speak to you for a moment?
Of course.
Sit down, won't you?
Thank you.
No, up here.
Oh, thank you.
Now, that brain that you gave me, was it Hans Delbrück's?
No.
Ah, good. Would you mind telling me whose brain I did put in?
And you won't be angry?
I will not be angry.
Abby someone.
Abby someone. Abby who?
Abby Normal.
Abby Normal.
I'm almost sure that was the name.
Are you saying that I put an abnormal brain into a 7.5-foot long, 54-inch wide gorilla? Is that what you're telling me? Quick, get him up!
What? 3 syllables, yes?
I wonder who that could be at this.
Current by the degree of agony he felt with the electrical current. This is not the normal sort of person. He couldn't talk to most people. He couldn't talk to women at all. His housekeeper would get a recipe for something or other and he'd say, no, lamb tonight, leg of lamb, and leave a note for her. He wouldn't say it, he'd write it. He would dine in the evening with his friends and he would talk to them, but if he didn't know somebody, and you wanted to ask him a question, apparently you had to go to the Royal Society and he would be in the room and you'd address the room this question about physics and you postulate, and if he felt in the mood, he would reply to the room. He was a very strange man. And yet he's absolutely wonderful. He invented hydrogen. People went up in hydrogen balloons and could see the world from, through that perspective. He did most of the experiments quietly on his own, keeping his notebooks. And it was only after his death and a persuasive campaign by Clerk Maxwell, the famous Maxwell of Maxwell's equations from Cambridge University, that he actually got the notebooks from the estate of the Dukes of Devonshire and discovered after the event that Cavendish had discovered the unit of capacitance, discovered dielectric constants, he discovered Dalton's law of partial pressures, he discovered or written about Coulomb's law, all before these guys had done it and just left it unpublished in his notebooks. Towards the end of his life, he did a crucial experiment, which is represented by these lead balls. He lived in Clapham Common, which is nowadays a very poor part of London, but there it was quite fashionable. And he built his own place. His library he built somewhere else because he didn't want anybody borrowing his books from his house. Otherwise, he would have to ask the book back and he didn't want to talk to them. So his library was 4 miles away.